The Siege of Yorktown, the 20 days that broke an empire for 8 years. The American Revolution seemed trapped in an endless cycle. Battles were fought. Armies marched. Cities changed hands. Victories were celebrated, then erased by defeats. To many watching from Europe, the rebellion looked less like the birth of a nation and more like a war that refused to end. Then, in the autumn of 1781, everything accelerated. In less than 3 weeks, a British army that had marched across much of the American South found itself surrounded, isolated, and running out of time. The army that had once represented the greatest military power on earth would soon lay down its weapons, not because it had been destroyed in open battle, but because an extraordinary chain of decisions had left it with nowhere left to go. The story of Yorktown is not simply the story of a siege. It is a story of deception, patience, international cooperation, and a series of calculated risks that only appear inevitable when viewed through history. At the time, almost nothing about it seemed certain. By 1781, Britain had spent years trying to crush the rebellion in North America. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. British regulars were among the best to train soldiers in Europe, and despite several setbacks, London still believed victory remained achievable. The Americans had survived, but survival was not the same as winning. General George Washington had spent much of the war confronting shortages that would have broken many armies. Food was scarce. Clothing wore out faster than it could be replaced. Soldiers completed enlistments and returned home. Money was constantly in short supply, yet the Continental Army endured. The British eventually shifted much of their attention toward the southern colonies, hoping loyalist support would allow them to regain control from the ground up. That campaign achieved impressive victories. But it also stretched British forces across enormous distances. One of those forces was commanded by Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis. After months of campaigning through the Carolinas and Virginia, Cornwallis eventually established a defensive position at the small port of Yorktown, situated along the York River near the Chesapeake Bay. From a military perspective, the choice appeared logical. The location allowed supplies to arrive by water. The Royal Navy could reinforce the position. If necessary, the army could even be evacuated by sea. The British had spent decades relying on naval superiority. Cornwallis expected that superiority to protect him once again. What he did not know was that events hundreds of miles away were already threatening the foundation of that assumption. Washington understood something many commanders missed during long wars. Victory rarely comes from fighting every battle. Sometimes it comes from recognizing the one battle that matters most. His army remained near New York, where British forces still occupied one of their strongest positions in North America. An assault there would be costly. Success was uncertain. Meanwhile, intelligence suggested Cornwallis had become increasingly exposed in Virginia. If the British army at Yorktown could be isolated before help arrived, the entire course of the war might change. The opportunity was extraordinary. So were the risks. Moving thousands of soldiers over hundreds of miles was difficult enough. Doing so without convincing the British that New York remained the true objective bordered on impossible. Washington embraced the challenge. False signals began flowing toward British observers. Construction projects hinted at preparations around New York. Routine military activity reinforced the illusion that a major attack was approaching there. The deception worked because it aligned with what British commanders already expected to see. While attention remained fixed on New York, the real movement unfolded elsewhere. American and French troops quietly marched south. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, wagons loaded with supplies. An entire Allied army crossed rivers, passed through towns, and covered remarkable distances with impressive speed. The success of the march depended on discipline. But even flawless execution on land would not be enough. The decisive factor lay offshore. For years, France had supported the American cause with money, soldiers, and naval power. Now that alliance faced its greatest test. Washington needed Admiral François Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, to bring the French fleet into the Chesapeake. If the French arrived first, Cornwallis could be trapped. If they failed, the British army might simply sail away. Everything depended on timing. Messages crossed the Atlantic slowly. Weather could change entire campaigns. No commander controlled the sea itself. As September approached, both fleets raced toward the Chesapeake. The British expected to reopen communications with Cornwallis. Instead, they encountered the French fleet already waiting. The resulting Battle of the Chesapeake did not resemble the spectacular naval annihilations often remembered from history. Neither fleet lost a ship, yet strategic victories are not always measured by wreckage. After hours of combat, the British withdrew. The French remained. That single outcome transformed the campaign. The entrance to the Chesapeake stayed closed. British reinforcements remained outside. Cornwallis's most reliable escape route suddenly disappeared. Without realizing it, his army had become part of a trap already beginning to close. Late in September, Washington reached Yorktown. The British defenses were formidable. Earthworks surrounded much of the position. Artillery covered likely avenues of attack. Several detached fortifications protected the perimeter. Launching a direct assault would have been extraordinarily costly. Instead, the Allies relied upon a method refined through centuries of European siege warfare. Engineers marked the ground. Soldiers dug trenches under cover of darkness. Each new line crept closer to the British defenses while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. It demanded patience more than glory. Every shovel of earth represented another step toward victory. British cannon fired regularly into the working parties. Sharpshooters searched for exposed targets. Progress came slowly, but every night the Allied trenches advanced. Soon, artillery pieces were dragged into newly completed positions. On the 9th of October, Washington ceremonially fired one of the opening guns. The bombardment intensified rapidly. Heavy cannon pounded British fortifications day after day. Buildings collapsed. Gun positions became increasingly difficult to defend. Ships anchored nearby came under fire. Inside Yorktown, conditions worsened with alarming speed. Shelter became scarce. Supplies diminished. Repair crews struggled to keep pace with the damage. Exhaustion spread almost as quickly as fear. Still, Cornwallis hoped circumstances might change. Perhaps the Royal Navy would return. Perhaps reinforcements would break through. Perhaps the Allied siege would falter. Instead, the pressure continued to increase. One obstacle remained before the Allies could tighten their grip completely. Two advanced British positions, known simply as Redoubts 9 and 10, prevented completion of another critical siege line. Leaving them in British hands meant delaying the final phase of operations. Taking them would require close combat. Artillery alone could not solve the problem. The attack would fall to infantry. On the evening of the 14th of October, carefully selected assault forces assembled in darkness. French troops advanced toward Redoubt 9. American troops targeted Redoubt 10. Among the American officers was a young Alexander Hamilton, eager for a field command after years serving on Washington's staff. Speed mattered. Surprise mattered even more. The attackers moved forward carrying unloaded muskets, intending to rely primarily on bayonets rather than gunfire. Silence lasted only moments. Soon alarms rang through the British lines. Musket fire erupted. The carefully planned assault transformed into desperate close-quarters combat. Men climbed over obstacles, scrambled up earthen walls, and fought at arm's length. The struggle was fierce but brief. Both redoubts fell. The victory opened the way for Allied engineers to complete the next trench line. Now the artillery moved even closer. Bombardment resumed with greater effect. Every passing hour reduced British options. One dramatic symbol of the deteriorating situation came when HMS Charon, anchored nearby, caught fire after coming under Allied bombardment. The burning vessel illuminated the river while reminding everyone inside Yorktown that the British position was steadily collapsing. Cornwallis refused to surrender immediately. Instead, he attempted one final gamble. During the night of October 16, boats began ferrying troops across the York River toward Gloucester Point. If enough soldiers crossed successfully, the British might break through weaker forces there and escape. For a brief moment, the plan appeared possible. Then nature intervened. A violent storm swept across the river. Powerful winds scattered boats and disrupted the crossing. Communication broke down. The evacuation stalled before it could be completed. By morning, the attempt had failed. The opportunity had vanished. Yorktown was now effectively sealed. The bombardment resumed. British defenses continued to crumble. Casualties mounted. Food became increasingly limited. Hope narrowed with every passing hour. On the 17th of October, an unmistakable signal appeared above the British lines. A drummer emerged. Soon afterward, an officer displayed a white flag. The firing stopped. After days of relentless explosions, silence settled across the battlefield. Negotiations began. For 2 days, officers discussed the formal terms. Neither side could erase what had happened. The only remaining question was how the campaign would end. On the 19th of October, British troops marched out to surrender. Thousands of soldiers stacked their weapons under the watch of French and American forces. Cornwallis did not personally attend, citing illness. Instead, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara represented the British command. When O'Hara approached Washington, protocol took over. Since Cornwallis had not appeared, Washington directed that the sword be presented instead to Major General Benjamin Lincoln, whose own surrender at Charleston the previous year gave the moment powerful symbolic meaning. The ceremony lasted only a short time. its consequences would last far longer. More than 8,000 British soldiers and sailors became prisoners. One of Britain's principal field armies in North America had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. News crossed the Atlantic slowly. When it finally reached London, the political shock was immediate. Support for continuing the war weakened dramatically. Although fighting continued elsewhere for a time, Yorktown fundamentally altered Britain's strategic position. Peace negotiations gathered momentum. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. Yet Yorktown's significance reaches beyond the birth of one nation. The campaign demonstrated that alliances could overcome even the strongest empire when strategy, logistics, diplomacy, and timing aligned. American determination alone would not have secured victory. French soldiers, French sailors, French financial support, and international politics all played indispensable roles. The siege also illustrated a lesson repeated throughout military history. Wars are rarely decided by courage alone. They are decided by supply lines, intelligence, engineering, geography, and the ability to recognize the decisive moment before it disappears. Washington recognized that moment. So did de Grasse. Cornwallis did not. For generations, Yorktown has been remembered as the battle that ended the American Revolution.
Strictly speaking, that is an oversimplification. The war did not end that afternoon. Treaties still had to be negotiated.
Governments still had to make decisions. But after Yorktown, the possibility of restoring British authority over the 13 colonies became increasingly unrealistic. Military victory had slipped beyond Britain's reach. History often remembers dramatic charges and famous speeches. Yorktown reminds us that history can also turn on quieter moments. A fleet arriving at exactly the right harbor. An army marching where no one expected. Engineers digging through darkness one trench at a time. A storm arriving at precisely the wrong moment. And finally, after weeks of calculation, endurance, and relentless pressure, a white flag rising above battered earthworks. In the end, the siege lasted only 20 days. But those 20 days reshaped the Atlantic world. They transformed a rebellion into an emerging nation. They altered the balance of power among empires. And they proved that even the strongest military power can be defeated when confidence gives way to complacency, and when opportunity is recognized by those prepared to seize it.